So we start with the presentation of Benjamin Belkacem, and the title of his paper is What is at Stake with Secularism in the Religious and Political Sphere of Arab World. Belkacem.
I try to treat this question on 3 points. I speak firstly about the question of compromise in the relation between the politics and the religion, the contemporary debates in Arab countries. Second, about the malaise of secularism. And finally, about the secular militancy. All of the doctrines, debates, and polemics, dialogues and controversies on the question of secularism are a testament to the increasing interest in secularism and the diverse point of view that exists. The interest of ulama, reformists, and liberal thinkers, as well as Arab intellectuals and politicians over the question of secularism also demonstrates the importance of the relation between politics and religion in the life of Arab societies today. The goal of this presentation is to contribute to the analysis of secularism in Arab countries by examining what is at stake in the political and religious spheres. The state-religion relationship is so connected in Arab countries that Islam has been imposed as the official state religion in national constitutions, except for Lebanon. Does this consist of a symbol of compromise among the express, a symbolic social and political dimension of Islam as the majority religion of the Arab societies? Or is it a desire of the Arab states to depoliticize religion in the face of Islamism's rise? The social and political realities shows this opposition ever growing between Islamization and the politicization of religion, which is to say that the latter is outside of the domain of politics, election, alternation. The social shifts, power, conflicts, Islamist dogmatism, and the influence of religious institutions, Mufti, Islamic University, like the influence of Al-Azhar in Egypt, have only reflected the dominated role that religion plays in the political and social spheres. It was Ali Abdel Razak who has expressed since the 1920s the need to adapt religious laws and to social, economic, and political development. He believed that it is almost self-evident that the derailing of women suffer their inclusion into the working world, the separation between power and temporal power, the practice of usury, riba, and the restriction of divorce and polygamy have become accepted by society without having to adopt legislation. However, the impact of Islamism on societies and the political religious orientation in Arab countries is such that depoliticization has become a question of compromise sought after by the Arab regimes to reconcile divergent positions. For economic and political plans, we find concrete examples of this form of compromise on 2 levels, governing elites and intellectual elites. The compromise, taswiya between religion and state, as remarked upon by Burhan Ghalion, had been one of the characteristics of post-colonial Arab countries. This compromise was not able to endure, according to him, the construction of the modern state. This conception of compromise, deployed by Burhan Ghalion from a historical perspective linked to the birth of modern states, is interesting. What Burhan Ghalion deems the end of compromise between religion and politics had not been experienced in the sense of rupture as he describes. We can see today that the more that political power was opened, the more Islamism showed itself to be intransigent and became radicalized. This has been shown by the cases of Egypt and Algeria in 1980 and 1990 respectively, where fundamentalism profited from the opening of the political life and the tolerance of religious parties. The failure of ideologies and economic politics of Arab nations, the defeat of the Arab nations against Israel on one side, and the success of the Islam revolution in Iran on the other, have contributed to giving the Islamic platform a certain legitimacy. Within the Islamic discourse itself, the Islamic revolution has become a factor in mobilization for social change. Above all, it has been useful as a model to allow for mobilization of the Islamic State and the end of secular regimes. In this manner, religion has become the force behind the political battle, to restate the commentary of Michel Foucault on the Iranian Revolution. The implication of a large part of Islamists in the revolts and social movements that have occurred and have been occurring in Arab countries recently shows their willingness to resurrect the project of Islamic State. The call for civil state rather than a religious one, Dawla Madaniya, La Diniya, by many political formations and a large part of civil society, following the fall of the Egyptian and Tunisian government, shows the relation between state and religion as a major source of tension in the current period. The state policy, which aims to control religion through both its depoliticization and its repoliticization, has not succeeded in separating itself from the religious institution. The crisis of Arab regimes has only contributed to create, according to Brian Turner, a socio-political background of the repoliticization of Islam. One has to recognize that the Islamization of society is occurring throughout the media, fatwa, books, school, university. Its objective is militant Islam, which through its leader represents the need for a real visibility of Islamic values at all the levels of social and political life. Olivier Roy speaks of a conservative Islamization that touches all Arab and Muslim countries, led by religious personnel that, despite being loyal politically, remains conservative in religion. The great problem which Islamization poses, according to Olivier Roy, is that of Shariatization from the point of view of a modern state. If for Olivier Roy, re-Islamization expresses itself on an institutional level, Bruno Etienne considers it to be a political awakening occurring throughout a policy of Islam rather than a religious renewal. From another angle, Franz Rassan Salame claims that it is only after the rise of Islamism that Arab regimes sought to associate with secular elites in order to deal with this phenomenon. For certain secular thinkers, this is how secular constitutes a real battle between depoliticization and Islamization. The politicization of religion represents a historical fact that corresponds to socio-political conflict throughout which the authority of the text, Quran, replaces the authority of reason. The rejection of secularism is a form of the politicization of the religion by religious institutions who, in the name of Quran, seek to impose their authority and censor the freedom of thought. For Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, what the Quran presents to Muslims is neither an Islamization of life, nor is it an absolute separation of life and religion. Separating religion from the state, said Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, is essential for protecting the integrity of religion. But this does not mean relegating religion to a backseat in society. The Quran and the original text give us no political theory and opposes no political principles. I firmly believe that separation of the state and religion is essential for protecting religion from political manipulation when the state identifies itself with a certain religion. Folks who belong to another religious tradition inevitably are discriminated against. A secular state one that gives no official sanction to any particular religion, gives a religion the space it needs to meet the needs of the people. The manner in which the relationship between religious and the birth of the Islamic Caliphate is presented in contemporary Arab thinking poses a real question of the future of secularism. Certain Islamist theories and specialists on Islam consider secularism to be enacted with different aspects. It must be remarked that, once again, this conception of secularism is still ambiguous. The critics of secularism today lead to compromise with the ideology that is imposed by Islamism. In social and political conditions characterized by authoritarianism and instability, it is not the separation of politics and religions that seem privileged, but the reconciliation of the two. If a reconciliation between secularism and Islam is possible or even inevitable to avoid the slide towards violence, in order to respond to this question that seem to impose themselves today in the debate over secularism, Hassan Hanafi, philosopher Egyptian, proposes under the banner of the famous slogan, the Islamic left, Yasar Islami, a solution of the right middle between Islamism and secularism. Born in Egypt in 1980 to protest against the liberalism of President Sadat, the Islamic left supports the project of a national, authentic, and conscientious society, an alternative to Islamic fundamentalism and to secularism based on the Occidental model. According to Hassan Hanafi, contemporary Arab societies are divided into two movements, the Salafiyya and secularism. The first claim to be a part of Islam's cultural patrimony, the other of Western origin. From this understanding, Hanafi considers that the secular solution, which is in Occidental doctrine, cannot be successful in Arab societies. The idea of the Islamic left on secularism consists of restating in a new language the problem of Arab societies while maintaining a religious sensibility of Islam's cultural patrimony and of colonial and Occidental modernity heritage. Its social projects aims to rediscover the religious and nationalist it, to render credible the policy and rethink it in humanitarian terms, to make it acceptable for the poor, the masses, and the religious institution in Arab societies. The conception of secularism among the Islamic left remained very philosophical. In giving praise to Sayyid Qutb and Khomeini to attract attention to the importance of social justice in Islam, the idea of secularism loses all its value and all its significance. Toward the secular militancy, what we consider as the malaise of secularism is a testament to the critical conception that takes into account the principle of conformity and secularism as an Occidental model with the tradition of Muslim societies. Speaking of Arab thinking, Fuad Zakaria remarks that it is because of its decline that secularism is surrounded by gross misinterpretations, not only amongst the public but also among intellectuals. The idea of secularism continues nevertheless, despite all criticism, to inspire certain political and intellectual Arab elites to fight for this idea. What we call secular militancy appears in the social and political context of the Arab world as a means of obtaining the recognition through which secularism institutes itself in the state. In 1984, while the civil and confessional war was raging in Lebanon, a group of lawyers, writers, students, and independent political personalities drafted a manifesto that led directly to secular republicanism. The manifesto was called the Permanent Congress of Secularism of Secular Lebanese. It was the first of its kind in Arab countries. It advanced a project precise and global for secularism. The manifesto adopted firstly its definition of sécularisme. La laïcité est une vision globale du monde. The secularism is a global vision of the world. After having distinguished between forms of secularism, the manifesto opted for a secularism founded on neutrality, the respect of all religions and all political tendencies. It was self-evident that the manifesto would insist on the importance of the secular solution for the problem that confessionalism, accepted by the majority of intellectual and political elites, posed in Lebanon. It is why these Lebanese intellectuals adopted a global and very particular conception of secularism that takes into account the political, cultural, and religious specificities of Lebanon. Taking into account the manifesto contended the secularism must be applied progressively in stages, the first being to bring about the end of confessionalism, not only in the text, but also in psychiatry. What is interesting to note in this manifesto is the mobilization of intellectuals to defend secularism in a country where politicians and religious persons are attached to the principle of confessionalism. In Egypt, where secularism was a century ago a cultural and political demand of liberal thinkers, religious and political tensions call today more than ever for a rethinking of the relationship between the political and the religious. The Congress of the Institution of Secularism in Egypt, reunited in 2006, wants to contribute not to relaunch a debate on secularism, but to the demand as a fundamental element of democracy, no democracy without secularism. As was the case of the Lebanon initiative, the Egyptian Congress brought together a group of intellectual, political, and religious leaders to lay down the foundation of secularism. Secularism, according to the manifesto, must be undertaken as a state project. This idea is very interesting. In clear terms, Leila Babes writes that secularism is first an affair of state, like la laïcité est une affaire, question d'État. Second, it is a contract that concerns the entirety of community. It is not an alternative, an option, or a personal opinion. Since secularism concerns the community, participants insist on the importance of associating civil society with this process. The institution of secularism begins, according to the secular Egyptian, by the separation of all indication of religion in administration documents and the outlawing of religious instruction in public schools, and most of all elimination of Article 2 of the Constitution that considers Islam as a religion of state. Such procedure will ensure the neutrality of the state and the equality of citizens. For the participants of the Congress of the Institution for Secularism in Egypt, there are several models of secularism upon which that Farashfuda is based. One, the right of citizenship as the principal element for national identity. Second, the Constitution as the pillar of power that guarantees the equality of all citizens and the freedom of beliefs without restriction. Three, the public interest, a pillar of the legislation. Four, a system of civil government which by its constitutional legitimacy guarantees the respect of laws and human rights. But the American model that guarantees the separation of powers and the autonomy of the religious sphere was also presented as a valid model for the social and cultural realities in Egypt. The secular political parties in Arabic countries. Secular is not limited on the political and intellectual movement. Nearly all the political parties include in their vision of society the relation between the political and the religious. The party Wafd, created in Egypt in 1990 during the fight for independence, was one of the first Arab parties to call for the separation of politics and religious. But with the rise of Islamism and the political issues in the contemporary Arab world, most of the parties have removed this idea from their program. Today, Wafd adopts a vision that approves of the statu quo implemented by the political regime, Islam as the official religion of the state. The work considers that religious values are essential for developing the good virtues a society needs. It is symptomatic of the problem faced by secular parties that many among them have problem of clearly defining their identity. Indeed, it is true that these parties are not militantly secular, a la Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, or ideologically committed to a French-style laicity. They simply are not embracing a political platform inspired by religious ideals, and that is why we refer to them as secular rather than secularist. The identity of the secular parties is indeed very troubling, caught between an authoritarian power that only allows for a very narrow margin of action and the radical Islamists for whom secularism is synonym of a religion. The secular parties don't have the social basis or any mean for actions. Nevertheless, secularists continue being to claim of certain political and intellectual elites that, even if in the minority, stick to the principle of separation between politics and religious as a project of society. For instance, this is the position of Said Saadi, for example, in Algeria, who explicitly defends secularism in the program of his political party. According to Said Saadi, the population of the Maghreb are able to freely practice their religion. For him, secularism is not a problem for the society, but for the political power. The type of secularism claimed by Said Saadi is not inspired by the French model, but from the social realities of Algerian society and the founding text of the Algerian state. Those social realities can be summarized by the fact that the Algerians have separated the practice of religion from civil and or political responsibility. The problem of secularism remains political because it depends on the will of the political powers. This being why secularism is at the center of the project of the party of Said Saadi for a modern society. For the Islamist parties and even certain currents of Algerian conservatism, secularism is a sign of a political and cultural plot as indicated by the vocabulary they use, the Party of France, Esperanza, the secular assimilationist, or the secular communists. They explain the distrust and rejection of even idea of secularism because it is considered as a product of Western culture and therefore incompatible with Islam. Likewise, it also explains the rejection of any form of social and political modernity considered as destructive of the cultural and religious values. Only certain parties on the left, Marxists in particular, defended secularism with pugnacity and consistency. Those parties, to which several intellectuals belong, are not so much parties of believers, but rather mass parties, to use the typology of Maurice Duverger. They carry a project of society not in line with the politics of the governments in place or with the Islamist ideology. Contrary to the Ba'athist parties in Iraq and Syria that come to power with the violence, the Marxist parties aspire to a radical social change by a popular movement of liberation. From the communist parties in Lebanon and Egypt in particular, secularism can only be achieved in the context of a larger egalitarian project. The struggle is not easy for the Marxist parties and the other secular parties. They have to fight on three fronts: Islamism, the political powers, and the public opinion. From Faraj Fouda, killed in 1992 for his secular ideas, the influence of Islamist groups in the Arab world and in Egypt in particular has led, on one hand, to the weakening of the secular parties that are very far from the masses and that are confronted with the religious slogans and idea for Islamic State. Does secularism have a future? Even if it has had an impact on the religious and cultural aspects, the liberal movement has quickly lost its momentum. The rise of Islamism does not show the failure of secularism, but its decline. It does not mean that secularism has lost its power, but that its grip and Arab thought has weakened. That is more remarkable and important that the secular activism that through the political parties, the civil societies, and the intellectual involvement has fought against radical Islamism. What is more remarkable and important as concerns the secular activism that the fact that the fact that throughout the political parties, the civil society, and the involvement of intellectuals, radicalism Islam has been seriously challenged. What we consider as secular solution is in reality a reconsideration of certain social and political problems related to the relation between politics and religion. It is indeed a new project of society and state that is stake, a tolerant and pluralistic society, a neutral and modern state. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll have question and answer, and Valérie has kindly accepted to do the translation. Do you want to start by some question, Valérie? Okay. Who wants to start?
Thank you, Belkacem, for your presentation. Actually, I don't have questions because, except for the context that you use when you're going from Lebanon to Egypt and then back to Algeria, and then I was thinking of Morocco also for the question of secularism. But I only have a few comments about Egypt for the problem concerning the second article of the Constitution. Is not that much that Islam is the religion of state as such. It's mainly the problem, in my opinion, is that Sharia is the main source of legislation. And you know the trick, Sadat changed the terms. That it used to be Sharia is one of the sources of legislations, and now it. Yeah, and that was the change that locked everything. Yesterday we were supposed to be in the same panel, and I presented something about the headscarf scandal, and I referred to a parliamentary debate that happened in the context of this scandal, and many Muslim brothers, but also neo-Waft MPs, member of parliaments, were using the second article of the Constitution to say Farouk Hosni, the minister who had declarations concerning the headscarf, has infringed the Constitution. So it's like you're locking any debate possible on anything that has to deal with religion. On the social point of view, I think Ilmani in Egypt is associated to kafir. You are talking about Hizb Faransa in Algeria, and when you said so, well, that's a question of colonial heritage, as you said. Because you won't have this kind of references in Egypt. It's if you are secular, then means you are a kafir, a renegade or kafir, renegade or infidel, something like that. And concerning the Marxist movements, also in Egypt, I have a few. I remember. Someone who was a historical figure in the Marxist movements, Youssef Darwish, who died in 2006. He was Karaite, Jewish, Karaite being the historical Egyptian branch of Judaism. And he had to convert to Islam to remain in the Marxist movement. So they did have problems to, how could I say, to have accommodating Marxist beliefs with religion. And also in the 80s, more in the 80s, as Islamism in society was rising in Egypt on campus, leftist groups, you had a lot of young women students, especially, who wore the hijab, even though they were in the party. I mean, as you said also in the beginning of your presentation, the difference between the Islamization of society and the politicization of Islam is a key concept to use. But also when we look at practices, social practices in political, especially for the Marxists, there are a few interesting things, I think, to look after with more depth, I think. But I thank you very much for your presentation.
Is there another question?
Thank you for your presentation. I'd like to focus on Algeria, and I have a question regarding the events or from the 1990s to 2000 and what has been sometimes called the civil war. And I know that it's a problematic term. It was followed by an amnesty imposed by Bouteflika. And my question is, has it changed the political game in terms of the relationship between politics and Islam, this specific amnesty laws? And in a broader way, maybe after the events of the 1990s, have the cards changed, politically speaking, in terms of a radical Islam in Algeria?
Bon.
Tu as compris? Yes.
Oui, alors, je réponds en français. Merci Henri pour tous ces commentaires. Je sais que vous connaissez très bien l'Égypte. Et je suis tout à fait d'accord avec vous. Bon, c'est des commentaires que le problème que qui se pose face à la question de la laïcité aujourd'hui dans les pays arabes, en Égypte en particulier, c'est ce fameux article, la charia est la principale source de législation. Alors qu'avant, à l'époque de Nasser, la charia est une des sources de législation. Je suis tout à fait d'accord, et à l'occasion du dernier référendum après la révolution en Égypte, cette question a été au centre du débat au sein des élites politiques égyptiennes, et surtout entre les Coptes et les musulmans. Ce qui paraît paradoxal un peu, c'est que même les Coptes aujourd'hui disent, bon, pourquoi pas si le principe de tolérance et de la neutralité de l'État sera respecté.
Okay, so the problem you write is that Sharia now is a principal source of legislation, and before, at the time of Nasser, it was one of the source of legislation. And this is a question that is at the center of the debate now between Copt and Muslim, and that's where you were. I think I summarize. If I forgot something, let me know. Hein?
Pour le commentaire sur les partis communistes, j'étais surtout intéressé par, vous parler de Derwish, moi j'ai surtout de Rifat Saïd, qui est un farouche opposant aux islamistes et qui est un laïc fervent aujourd'hui. C'est surtout à ses idées que je faisais référence, surtout qu'il est aujourd'hui le président du parti communiste en Égypte.
So he was referring, when he was talking about the Marxists, about Rifat Said, who is really an opponent to Islam, and is very adamant. and he was referring particularly to his ideas.
Alors, pour Soria, sur ce qui se passe en Algérie depuis 90 et la guerre civile, mon point de vue personnel, c'est que Bouteflika avait besoin d'un renforcement de pouvoir. Et pour faire passer cette loi d'amnistie qui permettait aux islamistes de revenir en force dans la scène politique et même aux terroristes.
Yes, Bouteflika needed reinforcement of his power to be able to have this law on amnesty, and so Islamists could get back into the political scene, and that's what the goal was.
Alors, il y a deux raisons pour cette amnistie. Un, c'est que, ce qui est vrai, le pouvoir a voulu tourner la page de cette guerre civile. Un. Deuxièmement,
so two reasons for this amnesty. One is that the power wanted to turn the page, to what was happening before and have a new start.
Et la deuxième raison, c'est ce qu'on ne dit pas, c'est que le pouvoir Bouteflika en personne avait besoin d'une force islamiste pour l'appuyer, pour mener non pas ses réformes, mais pour être candidat au deuxième mandat et après au troisième mandat.
And then the second reason is that Bouteflika needed the Islamic to get re-elected the second time and the third time. So he needed them, the support of the Islamists. But it is his personal point of view.
I have a question which comes from these last comments on amnesty and transition to a different system. I don't know if it's pertinent, but anyway, I throw it like that. If you take some momentous transitions to democracy, and I'm thinking mainly to South Africa, the elaboration of what is referred to as transitional justice was crucial from the legal point of view, but also from the political point of view, because in some way, in South Africa, for instance, the transition and the way transition was faced was the way in which a new African National Congress was forged, and so on and so on and so on. So now we have a body, an important body of achievements all over the world with transitional justice, which means a work on the memory, a work on the violence of the past, a work on abusive legal methods, social injustice, inequalities, and so on and so on and so on. So we have a corpus, a body of experiences, of elaborations of institutions which have been shaped and forged in different parts of the world. And my question is, I have the impression that when the transition in Northern Africa towards different systems is tackled, there is almost never reference to this corpus of experiences. So my question is there a reference to this other, let's put it like that, because that's simply because of my ignorance, probably. So is there a reference to these other experiences? And for instance, if you take South Africa, that's African. So I know that that experience was applied to Congo and to other realities. So there is a reason which is an African reason to take it into account. So is that taken into account, and how, and how in particular from the religious point of view? Because transitional justice in many experiences, including again South Africa, you remember that Desmond Tutu played a crucial role in the process. Is that something which could be applied? Is that something which could provide a reference, or precisely because there's not a very strong Muslim element, it's somewhere discarded from the beginning? Thank you.
On a souvent tendance en fait à comparer l'Algérie après la guerre civile à l'Afrique du Sud après la fin de l'apartheid.
One has a tendency to compare the situation in Algeria after the end of the apartheid in South Africa.
Cette comparaison me semble trompeuse.
It's not a good comparison.
Yes. Cette comparaison me semble trompeuse pour une raison simple, c'est que les conditions de transition ne sont pas les mêmes. L'Afrique du Sud a réalisé la vraie transition. Il y a l'ANC est au pouvoir après la fin
So the conditions of transition are not the same. In South Africa, you were a real transition, and
en Algérie, on vit la même situation. C'est le changement dans la continuité.
in Algeria, it's the change, but in the continuity.
Bouteflika était ministre en 1962. 50 ans, il est encore président de l'État. Il a fait 3 mandats.
Bouteflika was prime minister in 62, and now minister. I'm sorry, and he's still now a minister, president now. Yes, after 50 years.
Et deuxièmement, ce qui me semble aujourd'hui surtout grave, c'est que la violence continue aujourd'hui. Vous lisez les journaux chaque jour. On n'a pas encore mis fin à la violence.
And the political violence is still very strong. And every day in the newspaper, you see a lot of articles on murders, political murders.
Mais la question était, est-ce que le modèle de la justice transitionnelle, qui maintenant a plusieurs expériences et s'incarne dans différents contextes, est-ce que c'est quelque chose auquel il est fait référence dans les contextes nord-africains? Est-ce que ce modèle-là est quelque chose qui apparaît ou dans le corps?
Il n'y a pas de contexte nord-africain. Le seul contexte, c'est le contexte algérien, puisque c'est là où la guerre était atroce. C'est le seul modèle. Mais le modèle n'a pas été appliqué tel quel. On parlait de la transition, on parlait de la tolérance, on parlait de l'amnistie. Mais les raisons politiques sont autres que celles décidées par le pouvoir, par les Sud-Africains.
So if I understand correctly,
The answer is no.
the answer is no. Basically, they don't take into account the transitional jurisdictional model. So I suggest we stop. Thank you very much.